Tonight, Brier Miller Minor is going to tell us about the Del Mar estate, commonly referred to as the Snakewall Property. She's written a book about it called Walking the Wall, Life Behind Del Mar's Snakewall. If you have questions that come up during her talk, please type them into the Q&A box during the program. This can be found at the ribbon in most cases, at the bottom of your screen. The questions then will be answered at the end of the program. Brier Miller Minor grew up in Southern California, where she got to spend memorable August at her grandparents' estate in Del Mar, enjoying the beach and the seemingly endless days of summer here. She left California for Colorado College in 1968 and moved to the Midwest in 1976. She earned a master's degree in marriage and family therapy at the University of Wisconsin and has passionately practiced and taught family therapy for close to 40 years. In 2014, she received the Distinguished Service to the Field Award from the Minnesota Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Already established as a productive author in her profession, she began writing creatively in the early 2000s and has been part of a writing group for more than 10 years. She's never forgotten her idyllic summers walking the wall that surrounds Atalaya. I hope I pronounced that right.
You did.
That surrounds that wall with its challenges and unexpected revelations. The opportunity to write a book about it is the fulfillment of a long-held dream. It's been a rewarding journey of remembering and discovery, she says, about a significant time in Southern California history. Brier lives in Minneapolis, where she and her partner, Bruce Minor, are lucky enough to have all 3 of their kids and 8 grandchildren close by. Tonight, through the magic of Zoom, she comes to us from Minneapolis to show us what she found out in researching and writing the history of the iconic Del Mar estate, more familiar to many of us as the Snakewall Property. So here is Brier and her intriguing story.
Thank you so much, Susan. All right, let me see if I can figure this out. Okay, well, welcome everybody. I wish I could see you. I'll be honest, but I'm gonna try to feel your presence. I know that I have some family watching tonight, and that gives me encouragement. So, as Susan said, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And before I go further, I want to thank the Friends of Solana Beach Library for hosting me. I also want to say thank you so much to Larry Brooks for the years of support and encouragement and lots of information that he's shared with me about Del Mar. And I want to give a particular shout out to Linnea Dayton, who not only edited and published this book, but really helped create it. I couldn't have done it without you, Linnea. So as Susan was saying, I got to have the wonderful pleasure of growing up, going to my grandparents' vacation property during my childhood. It was an amazing experience. I spent every August there since I can remember until I went away to college. And one of the things that we did when we were there was walk the wall. So I was walking this perimeter wall that you can see around. You can see part of it. It's much bigger than this. But anyway, this perimeter wall that went around the property. And as a child, I was walking the wall. And as an adult, I've been remembering it, writing about it, and wondering about it. So let me get started, and I'll share some of the process about writing it as I go. Here's my book. Let me read you the introduction. I want to tell you a story. It's my story, at least in part, but it doesn't belong to me. It's a story of place, and like many places, this one has witnessed generations of communities and families holding firm while all sorts of stories played out through the years. And the place lives on, beckoning, quietly guarding the history, the memories, always offering the opportunity for new tales to develop. Let me introduce you to my grandparents, Mildred and Coy Burnett, who in the roaring 20s purchased an arts and crafts style house atop the highest hill in the lovely seaside village of Del Mar. My grandfather's newly made wealth as the cement mogul in the boom town of Los Angeles allowed them to buy the vacation home with its 360-degree view over the vast, sparkling Pacific Ocean to the west, and to the north and east, the San Dieguito River and its wide valley. In addition to the house, they bought 22 adjacent hilly acres covered in eucalyptus, acacias, and rare Torrey pines, the makings of a unique estate. They named their property La Atalaya, Spanish for the lookout, honoring the view. And she flourished and fell, and picked herself back up again, and lives on today, as splendid as ever. La Atalaya, this exquisite place by the sea, doesn't belong to my family anymore. But as the San Dieguito and La Joyan people knew when they lived here thousands of years ago, places don't ever really belong to us. If we're lucky though, we belong to them. The more I wrote about my childhood memories, the more my adult curiosity kicked in, and I began to wonder, how did my grandfather, who grew up on a farm in Nebraska, ever end up as an industrialist and cement, president of a big cement company in the Los Angeles area? How did my grandparents even know about Del Mar? What was the story behind the building of the estate? So that story starts with my grandfather, Coy Burnett, who's here on the right, with his older brother, William. And I'm pretty sure that the M on their caps is for McCook, Nebraska, which is where their farm was. When Coy was in high school, he got a job caring for the prize show horses of a prominent attorney in town. And this lawyer got interested in Coy and offered him a job in his law firm, as long as he could learn to do shorthand. And my grandfather did that and found that he had a real interest in the law. He stayed on in that firm for a year after high school, and then he went off to the law school in Lincoln, Nebraska. But he dropped out after only 2 semesters because he was already working full-time in a law office and was eligible to take the bar exam, which he did, and he was admitted as a fully authorized attorney by the time he was 21. A few years later, Coy was sent to the upper Northwest to represent and run a case in the lumber industry. And he liked it so much he ended up staying, and he settled in Portland, where he opened his own practice and worked mostly as a corporate attorney. While he was in Portland, he married Mildred Kingsbury, and they had their first child in 1916, a daughter, whom they named after my grandmother's maiden name. So she was named Kingsbury and called King for much of her life. It was also while my grandfather was in Portland that he met 2 men who had a fascinating business proposal, and they wanted him to join as a full partner. But he was successful as an attorney and reluctant to throw his hand in completely with these 2 men. So he agreed to a partial representation, that he would represent them as in a partial partnership in their negotiations for a defunct cement plant in the mountains near Los Angeles. This requires that I take you back a little bit. This is a picture of my grandfather, by the way, taken years after that would have happened. That was when he was probably in his late 20s, early 30s. This picture is much later, but I think it captures perfectly the sort of wheeling and dealing that I imagine went into these meetings. My grandfather's there in the middle, smoking a cigarette with a cigarette holder. Anyway, in order to understand the back history of this, I had to dig a little bit into the history of early LA. The Los Angeles area has always been a beautiful place to live because of the climate, the Mediterranean climate, and but it is unfortunately somewhat bereft as a semi-arid climate of fresh water. And as long as it was a fairly small population, the Los Angeles River could be used to irrigate crops and provide water to the population. But by the 1800s, Los Angeles was growing rapidly, and the early city forebears were very concerned about the need for more water. A drought in the early 1900s accelerated the concerns, and by 1907, it was determined to bring water from the Owens River about 200 miles north on the other side of the Sierras and bring it across all that land down to the Fernando Reservoir, where you can see here on the map. So if you look up at the top of this map, it's got the Owens River intake, and the aqueduct, the Los Angeles Aqueduct, would be designed to tunnel through mountains, cross deserts and valleys, bringing precious water all the way to where it could be accessed by the residents of Los Angeles. It was recognized right away that one of the most expensive things about building this would be the amount of material, concrete to be precise, that would be needed to build the aqueduct. And the main ingredient in concrete is cement, that gritty kind of mixture that when mixed with water, sand, and gravel creates concrete. So the city of Los Angeles built a municipal cement plant up in the Tehachapi Mountains and named it Monolith. And alongside the cement plant across the road was a little town where the workers at Monolith and their families could live. It was a successful project. It took 7 years of hard labor to complete the aqueduct. And when it was done, it was huge news. It was considered to be a tremendous engineering feat, second only to the Panama Canal. And in fact, it's the longest aqueduct in the world. So once the aqueduct was finished, the future of Monolith was a little bit shaky. For a while, it was able to continue at the municipal level, but it was finally shut down. That's when my grandfather comes into the story. Representing his partners, he traveled back and forth between Portland, where he maintained his law practice, and Los Angeles in order to negotiate the purchase of the plant at Monolith. And finally, after several months or maybe a couple of years of negotiating, in April of 1920, there was an agreement, a 5-year lease agreement to the purchase of the plant. And the conditions of the agreement were that the company would have to show that they were making a profit in those 5 years. And second of all, come up with the balloon payment to pay the city of Los Angeles for the remainder of the expenses and the price of the cement plant. And my grandfather, I think, brilliantly negotiated that if they could get to that 5-year mark and be successful, they would pay off the city, not in money, but in cement. They stuck with the name Monolith. It was too good to pass up. And that was the birth of the Monolith Portland Cement Company. My grandfather actually ended up buying out one of the partners, and very quickly, within just a couple of years, went from being representing just the legal interests to actually running the plant and becoming primary stockholder, and finally president of the company, a position that he held for almost 50 years. I want to go back to this picture in part because, as I said, it really captures that feeling of the men in charge, negotiating and so forth. But I also am very fond of it because it's taken in a room that I know well. It was in my grandparents' house in Los Angeles when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s. This was in the smoking room. And let me take you there for a minute. I remember that my cousin, Dana, the son of Coy's daughter, Anne, loved to pull us younger cousins aside and speculate about how Granddaddy got Monolith, whispering about the mysterious death of one of his partners, the suspicious circumstances behind our grandfather's rapid ascent to power in the cement business. When visiting our grandparents' elegant home in Los Angeles during the 50s and 60s, we cousins didn't find it hard to believe that Dana's stories might just be right, especially when walking past the dining room with its dinner table that could be expanded to seat 30 to 40 people, we caught a glimpse through the door next to it into Granddaddy's study. Dark, wood paneled and masculine, with leather-covered armchairs and an attached all-black marble bathroom. The room seemed to match our grandfather's somber and rather forbidding character. It was called the smoking room, which somehow added to it an aura of being off limits to us kids. When visiting our grandparents, we usually crept quickly past the smoking room door, but occasionally we were invited in. We went willingly, in spite of our pounding hearts, because we knew that in the top left-hand drawer of his shiny mahogany desk, Granddaddy kept an inexhaustible supply of Clorets gum. While we watched, he'd take out one of the little boxes, always a fresh one, and ceremoniously remove the cellophane wrapper from the bright green and white cardboard packet. Opening the tiny tab on one end, he'd shake the little pillow-shaped rectangles of chewing gum into the palm of his hand and offer them to us. The gum was covered with a hard candy coating, bright green, like the box. Sharply minty, it produced a satisfying crunch with the first bite. Coy's rapid ascent to power and responsibility didn't come for free. And sometime during the early 20s, he actually had a breakdown. His blood pressure shot through the roof, and he was ordered by his doctors to several weeks of complete rest, at the end of which they were still concerned. And so they advised that he should find a place outside of the city where he could retreat from the hubbub and the pressures of being a company president. So he talked to a fellow industrialist and neighbor on Wilshire Boulevard in LA, who had recently bought a vacation home in an up-and-coming resort town down the coast called Del Mar. And this is a map from the promotional brochure of the South Coast Land Company. The South Coast Land Company was formed in 1905, I believe it was, early 1900s. A collaboration between several financiers with a grand scheme to develop the entire coast of Southern California, basically from LA to San Diego. These teeny little seaside towns, turn them into resort cities that would be all connected by an electric train called a red car. The first place that they chose was Del Mar. And you may be familiar with this, but the Stratford Inn was the sort of centerpiece of the resort with its Elizabethan half-timbered architectural look, which set the tone for the whole little town. There was a warm water plunge and a bathhouse. There was a dance pavilion on the beach, a 1,000-foot pier. It was all very elegant. And the other thing that they did was have several lots for development. They were trying to attract people to come and build their own vacation homes and take advantage of all the resort facilities. This is the cover of their amazing brochure, which, by the way, is a full brochure is in the Del Mar room at the Del Mar Library, and it's a lot of fun to look at. It's also fun to read the lyrical writing. I have just a clip here. Del Mar is the musical and softly euphonious phrase used by the Castilian to mean of the sea. It goes on, nature has been particularly beneficent in this portion of San Diego County. At no other point on the entire coastline between Los Angeles and San Diego is to be found so picturesque, so magnificent, a hillside sloping gently down to the sea. One of the developers, a man named Henry Keller, his sister got interested with her husband in purchasing a lot, and actually they bought one of the premier sites at the very northern end of the highest ridge in Del Mar. This great picture was taken from 1912, and it essentially is the view out towards the ocean from the Keller's house as it was being built. You can see the powerhouse off in the distance there by the ocean. And you can see that Del Mar was really undeveloped at this point. And while the South Coast Land Company ended up their dreams all going bust because they got beat out by a standard regular train, and the red car bit the dust. But they had really developed something there in Del Mar, and silent screen stars started coming, and by the 30s, you had a bustling town. But let me take you back to the house that the Kellers built. It's an arts and crafts style house up on top of the ridge with about an acre lot. So this is the house that my grandparents bought. And along with it, they purchased the 22 additional acres that essentially went up and over the hill and went all the way down the hill on the eastern slope down to the San Dieguito River or lagoon, or the slough, as we called it when I was a kid. And on that eastern hillside is a level part, and several outbuildings were designed and built. And so you can see this would have been the view in the 20s, overlooking that lower section on the hill and then out over the river valley. This was huge news. Clip from the newspaper in 1925. Burnett, president of the Monolith Portland Cement Company, is spending $150,000 on improvements on his land alone. These include a $25,000 7-room concrete house for his servants, now completed, a conservatory, 65 by 80 feet, a laundry and drying yard, a chicken house and run, 35 by 85, a wall around his entire 23-acre estate, and a switchback driveway from his house on the crest of the hill, overlooking both the sea to the west and the canyon to the east, down to his stables 350 feet below. The mastermind behind this whole project was a man who was already pretty well established, or getting well established in San Diego, by the name of Richard Requa. And his architectural firm, Requa and Jackson, designed all of the buildings, the wall, the landscape plantings, and so forth. Requa himself did a lot of that work. And the plans only got bigger. By 1926, the newspaper had another announcement that now the plan was to build a $750,000 mansion where the original little house sat, moving that house to another part of the property, and then completing the wall, which was yet to be built. However, Coy Burnett and Richard Requa had a different project to work on. And that was a series of portfolios and books that were created by the Monolith Portland Cement Company, an unusual publisher, I think, paid for Requa to travel to Morocco, Spain, and other parts of the Mediterranean in order to photograph, as it says here, the old world architecture and bring it back to specifically Southern California to inspire others to build in this style. Now, obviously, this was a way to showcase Requa's work and make his name available, but it also had the intent of encouraging people to build their stucco homes with cement, and not just any cement, but monolith Portland cement. This book, as you can see, was dated 1929. Let me take you a little bit closer into the property. So this is part of the landscape map that Requa did. And it doesn't just have the buildings, but it's got the plantings where the rabbit run and the avocado grove and so forth and so on. But as you look at it, and then you see the picture at the bottom, this is essentially the manifestation of that architectural map. So you can see the conservatory on the far left, the abundant gardens, the garage and servants' quarters above it, the drying yard and the chicken run. And this is a closer picture of that lower section. And I like this because you can get a feel of these beautiful cutting gardens. And over on the right, you can see on the lower level, the sheets and bedding hanging in the drying yard. But what's particularly interesting to me in this photograph is as you look down towards the bottom of the hill where the road runs, there is no wall yet. So this would have been the late 20s. Here I take you inside the house at the top of the hill in the music room. That portrait is the only son of the Burnetts, Coy Jr., that hangs in my house now. Outside the breakfast room, Requa designed and they built this beautiful fountain. It looks like it was brought from Morocco or somewhere in southern Spain and plopped outside this arts and crafts style cottage. Such a big property requires a lot of people to help run it. And this is the house staff picture taken. The cook, as you can see, with her unbelievably long arms around the housekeepers and on the ends, the children's nurses. Jessie, here on the left side of the photograph, Jessie Wells Carter, worked for the family before 1929, but in 1929, her life there changed because of the birth of the youngest Burnett child on February 14th, 1929. And in honor of that date, she was given the name Valentine. And Jessie was promoted to being her nurse. This was not a part-time job. Jessie and Val, who would become my mother, incidentally, Jessie and Valentine lived at La Atalaya with Coy Jr. and Coy's nurse and Auntie Two, their aunt who tutored them at home. Meanwhile, my grandparents, Coy and Mildred, lived in LA at the LA Country Club. So Jessie really raised my mother for the first 10 or 11 years. That was her primary caregiver. They were close and they remained close as my mom got older. However, you might have noticed that my mother was born in 1929 while Requa was off in Morocco and so forth, and they were publishing his photographs. And the roaring 20s came to a roaring halt in October with the crash of the stock market and the beginning of the Great Depression. So the plans for the mansion on top of the hill were completely scrapped, but Requa did design a several-story addition to the original arts and crafts, and you can see part of it here, a rather unlikely combination, but it looks like it works. And the addition held the bedrooms of the family and also the children's nurses. On the back of this photograph, my mother has written, "Jessie outside my bedroom window." And if you do nothing else to share your story with family and future generations, make sure to label some of your pictures. It's really helpful. My grandparents had to give up their luxurious living in LA, and they moved up to the guest house in the Tehachapi Mountains so my grandfather could continue to run Monolith, and they would occasionally come down to Del Mar. But the Depression didn't end everything. In fact, it prompted the building of the wall. My grandfather was concerned as there was more and more publicity about angry stockholders raising up against company presidents and attacking them, threatening them, etc. And he decided it was time to build the wall to keep his family safe. So the wall was built, and it wasn't the only sign of needing for protection. There was also the giant mastiff dogs that lived on the property. Now, growing up, what I heard from my mom were these were her pets, and she had a lot of fun with them. She was a pretty lonely kid, and so having playmates was great, even the form of canines. But years after she died, talking to my Aunt King, I learned that these dogs were actually purchased as guard dogs to roam the property and scare off anybody crazy enough to try to climb over that wall, which, by the way, is 6 or 7 feet high. Crown jewel of the entire wall is the gate at the top of the hill. There are actually 3 gates accessing different levels of the property. But this gate up at the top, with its beautiful arch and the name La Atalaya spelled out in brightly colored Mexican tiles, is a very charming and still exists today as a charming accomplishment of this architect. But you know, in spite of the fact that it's clearly labeled La Atalaya for anybody to read, for some reason, at some point, somebody started calling it the Snakewall Property. And there are all kinds of stories about why it's called the Snakewall Property. But I think the most prominent one is the one that was told about my mother. The idea that Coy decided to build this wall to protect his new little girl, and after she saw a rattlesnake on the property, and she was so terrified of snakes that he had an entire wall built, which, by the way, is about 3/4 of a mile long. No small endeavor. Well, this is pretty obviously incorrect, since the wall was part of the plan right from the mid-20s and so forth. But it was also funny to us because we knew our mother. Mama was never afraid of snakes. However, the name Snakewall came about, the story about our mother's fear of snakes was pretty funny. Somewhere there's a photo to prove it. She was volunteering at the LA Zoomobile the day the picture was taken, smiling and holding a very large serpent as it coiled up her arm and over her shoulders. I think she liked that picture partly because it set the record straight. She had no problem when it came to snakes, but she understood my father's fearful reaction, explaining to us kids that we humans, as primates, have an innate fear of snakes because they are a natural threat to us. I can't find that picture from the Zoomobile, but fortunately, it's not the only picture of my mother holding snakes. I believe she was in Indonesia when she had this picture taken. Another reason that legend about building the wall to keep the snakes out is pretty amusing is that, you know, it actually keeps a lot of snakes in. And that was still true in the 1950s and 60s when we were kids. The rattlesnakes on the property and the threat they posed were a real problem. But unlike some problems, this one had a solution, an exciting solution, at least to us kids. We were playing with the hose, spraying down the wide expanse of concrete driveway, watering the few flowers and more often each other. The 4 of us kids, me, Tim, Claire, and Pat, were in full summer mode, skin browned and hair lightened and a little salty from our days at the beach, a minimum of clothing, barefoot like me, or maybe wearing rubber flip-flops, which back then we called thongs. The driveway was rough under my feet, and the cold water from the hose made chilly little puddles on the hot concrete. I was walking barefoot across them, hot, cool, when a white van came through the gates. We watched, curious, as it came slowly down the driveway. We didn't get many visitors. The van stopped near the wire mesh fence that was supposed to keep the rattlers on the untamed side of the property out of the yard. There was a clump of wild amaryllis just on the other side of the fence, and the lipstick pink flowers on tall, straight stalks looked like flags. The sweet, spicy perfume of the flowers intermingled with the steamy smell of the wet pavement as we gathered around the vehicle. A man got out of the van and walked to the back, and we followed. Unlocking the doors, he slowly took out a large crate, then two more, and set them on the driveway. We got a little closer. Opening one of the crates, he carefully extracted a very large snake. We all stepped back. What kind of snake is that? As usual, our little brother Patrick asked the question on all our minds. King snake? Does it bite? Not us. King snakes are harmless to humans. Want to hold it? Pause. Then nonchalantly, sure. The man solemnly handed one snake to each of us four slightly breathless kids. We could feel the cold, muscular bodies trying to slither up our arms. Getting bolder, we held their heads up and looked closely at their bright, knowing little eyes and their flickering tongues. We finally had to give them back to the man, who then walked over to the wire mesh fence. He made a little show for us as he released the king snakes one at a time onto the other side of the fence. We watched as they disappeared, slipping into the dry brush where they would make a new home and seek out their favorite foods, among them rattlesnake. As difficult as the Depression years were, for the kids at Monolith, there was a surprise treat. All the way during the Depression and up until the war began, any child between the ages of 7 and 14 whose parent worked in Monolith would get to go someplace exciting. But first, let me show you a picture. Catalina Island. And as you can see, here is Catalina, which is off the coast of Southern California. The company would pay, so it was an all expense paid Children's Week on Catalina. And here's somebody's helpfully sent a picture to my mother that was taken one year with all the girls group that year. And they've pointed her out there, Val Burnett, with old Avalon in the background. And there was even a poster every year for kids to keep as a souvenir. This is one that my mother had saved from 1939. And you can see from some of the pictures what they were all up to: the water sports, the checker games, the pony and cart rides, the races on the beach. And one of my favorites over to the left here is the sack races. And I don't think you can make it out, but if you could, you would see that these aren't just any burlap sacks. These are actually Monolith Portland cement bags. My grandfather was always one to get the brand name out there. Just above the sign, you can see these temporary quarters that were put up. My mother always talked about the tent village that would get set up on Catalina. And believe me, these were some of the best memories of her youth. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Desi. As much as I've written about walking the wall, I've written just as much about Jessie. She's a very important person in my family and in my own story. As I said, she raised my mother. And it wasn't just my mother she was close to. She was also close to Coy Jr., who, after all, grew up in Del Mar also during those years. And I don't think there's a picture that does a better job showing this closeness than this one, which is from a photo strip, a strip of pictures from a photo booth at a carnival. And it looks like Coy has won a couple of exciting prizes here. But it wasn't just my mother's generation that Jessie was close to, because when I was less than 2 years old and my brother Tim was a baby, Jessie came to live with our family. And she lived with us all the way until I went off to college. This is a picture of us getting ready to get in the car to sadly go home from Del Mar one year. It's me on the right, and I'm holding my Welsh Corgi Taffy. There's Jessie with her dog Hansi. my brothers Tim and Patrick, and Claire holding our cat Fluffy, and a couple of folks who worked for my grandfather. I couldn't possibly share everything I've written about Jessie or all my thoughts, but I would like to give you a little glimpse. Jessie was a faithful churchgoer. Her church in Southern California, which she attended while she lived with us in Rolling Hills and later while she lived in Watts, was an altogether different experience than attending the Episcopalian services near our house. As far as I can recall, the deacons were all women, Black women, who called each other by their last names. So Jessie was Carter, which we thought was kind of funny. We felt welcomed at her church. It was full of spirited singing and praising and folks who seemed a lot happier to be there than the people did at St. Francis, where we usually went with Mama. Jessie had a story about me and her friend Brunson, whose first name I never knew. I was little, about 3 years old, and I think we were visiting Brunson's house. She and Jessie had gone into the kitchen, and when Brunson came back into the living room to check on me, I had apparently eaten a number of fancy chocolates from a gift box on the coffee table. According to the story, Brunson said, "Oh, I don't think Jessie would like you to do that, Brier." And I responded, a chocolatey circle around my mouth. "Don't you say that to Brier. Don't you say that." Jessie always laughed telling that story, and I always felt happy hearing it. She just had a way of making you feel good about yourself. Accept it, no matter what. Along with going to the beach almost every day and walking the wall, once every August, we got to dress up, get in our grandparents' limousine, and be chauffeured to the Del Mar racetrack, where our grandparents had a box in the turf club. And it was always exciting. The fancy meal, the races themselves, our grandfather buying us tickets until we won, and seeing the celebrities. Jimmy Durante, of course, was a fixture. We got his signature more than once. But the most exciting celebrities we knew were in the box just above my grandparents for a number of years. Another couple who loved the races and had a vacation home in Del Mar, Lucille and Desi Arnaz. So this is my grandmother with the Arnazes behind her. And I believe the story of this photograph is that both Desi and Lucy had a horse in the race, but not the same horse. I believe Desi's horse was losing and Lucy's was about to win. I love this photograph because it memorializes the experience, but I especially like it because it looks like it's really taken of my grandmother and they're just incidentally there in the background. In 1971, my grandfather died, Coy died, and Mildred decided that she could not afford the upkeep of the Del Mar property or the mansion in Los Angeles. So both of them were put up for sale. The Del Mar property, La Atalaya, for a few years went through some different real estate machinations, but eventually, late in the 70s, ended up in the hands of a man named Jim Smith. Mr. Smith, his guard at his property, called him the year that I tried to visit in the early 80s. And I honestly thought it was some sort of alias for a criminal. Jim Smith wasn't a criminal, but he was definitely a mover and a shaker and a person who had a lot of tricks up his sleeve. If anybody remembers him during the 70s and 80s into the 90s, he was quite a character. And he was always had a scheme to make money out of the property, which he was actually letting kind of go to ruin while he kept cooking up these schemes. And his most memorable scheme was wanting to develop a luxurious resort hotel and well, basically an entire resort within the gate, within the walls. And you can see here from his fancy brochure that he was extremely serious about it. And in fact, put it as a proposal to the Del Mar City Council. But unfortunately, they weren't too interested in having a big bustling resort on the property. So, but Jim Smith got enough signatures to put it on a special ballot before the citizens of Del Mar to seriously consider what a wonderful addition to their community would be this luxurious resort here done in an artist rendering in Smith's brochure. There was even a slogan: if you agree with what you see, vote yes on Measure C. Well, you know, there's a history in Del Mar of resort hotels, the Casa Del Mar, the Stratford Inn, being there for a little while, maybe a little longer, but never quite making it in the end. In Jim Smith's case, the hotel was no more than this drawing because the voters decidedly did not want to say yes to Measure C, and his plans all fell to ruins. So then he had this white elephant on his hands in the late 80s, early 90s, kept dropping the price and waiting for buyers to come. Eventually they did, the current owners, who have done an amazing job working as stewards of the land and restoring the property to the beautiful state that it's in today. I wouldn't want to let you go tonight without answering the question that I'm sure is burning on most people's minds, which is, how exactly do you walk a wall? The first and arguably most critical step in walking the wall was to get up on top of it. The concrete in the wall was not smooth. Rather than the evenness of a plastered interior wall, imagine running your hand along a rough, almost gravelly concrete surface, perfect for scraping off layers of skin if we weren't careful, but better for holding on as we walked along the top. We may have worn sneakers sometimes, but in my memories, walking the wall was conducted while barefoot. At the beginning of each August, our feet were a little tender, but after a week or so, they had toughened up from racing across the big expanse of concrete driveway in front of the house and playing in the coarse sand in the side yard. Once we got on top, where the original house had stood, the biggest challenge was when we came to the main entrance to the property with its colorful Mexican tiles spelling La Atalaya. It soared up from the wall and into an arch several feet above the wrought iron gates that in our Mother's Day welcomed guests to the estate. On the very top of the arch, we would pause for breath and look out over Serpentine Drive as it circled around outside the wall and take in the breathtaking panoramas to the east and the west before we carefully climbed down the other side and proceeded on our way. Soon we were facing the most challenging part of wall walking, the descent. There was no way around it. If we retraced our steps and went back the way we came, we would still have to navigate the downward slope back to our starting point. Rather than going back, we preferred to walk the entire circle. Where the wall started going down on the far side of the property, the ground was craggy and forbidding on both sides. The rugged terrain covered with prickly weeds and small cactus, and maybe a rattlesnake or two hiding under the protruding rocks. So going down the hill was less like walking and more like scrambling and scooting along the wall, our feet in front, inching along on our bottoms, gripping the rough concrete with our hands, fighting gravity. And you know, as wonderful as walking the wall and playing at our property in Del Mar, and even going to the races, as fun as all of that was, going to the drugstore and spending our money. I was always buying Nancy Drew books at the bookstore when I could save up $1 plus 5 cents for tax. But more than anything, it was the beach. It was a fine tradition. My mother and her brother spent their childhood on the Del Mar beach, and so did we. The wide blue ocean, like the wall at La Atalaya, was a great teacher. while walls tend to represent enclosure, constraint, and separation. For us, the wall meant freedom, abandon, and togetherness. Our wall, with its strange myths and legends as the snake wall, may have kept some snakes out, but it kept a lot in too. It wasn't simple. There was no single truth. A wall marks an intersection, a meeting place, connecting one side with the other, even as it separates them. The wall taught us about perspective and connections. The ocean taught us about the beauty of impermanence, while it invited us to appreciate the everlasting, deeper rhythms of life and the faithful presence of the sea and the land. And that does it for me in my book talk tonight. So maybe some people have questions, which I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, Brier. I do have some questions that have come up. Susan, do you have anything to conclude there?
The only thing I wanted to say was that was absolutely fascinating. I knew none of that. Just adds so much to our appreciation of our whole history. For any of you,
I just wanted to say something, and I sort of spaced this out because I'm so happy that I completed this, to be honest with you. But I wanted to say just a word about encouraging people. This history, there's a great deal here that I didn't know much about either. And there's so much information available now through the internet. And one thing I wanted to show you was a slide here of some of the resources that I used. The Del Mar Historical Society and so forth, but of course, various ancestry and so on. But I found lots of information in blogs. I'm part of a writing group that's been very, very helpful to me. And there are also folks that will help people if you want to write your life story, if you feel like you need help doing it. But by the way, using audio or video recording is just such a special thing to do. But these are a few, and I think these will be kept, this will be put up on the library website, I think. But these are some resources if you're interested in going forward and either writing or even trying to publish. I add here at the end, if you're not part of a writing group, find one or start one. It's so helpful if you're interested in writing. And one last comment that I would make is, of all the resources that I used, the most important one was a person. And that was my mother's oldest sister, Kingsbury, who lived into her 90s. And I was so lucky to be working on this book while she was still alive, because she helped me, pointed me in the right direction, filled in blanks, and she, not only that, but she saved letters and documents and so forth. I couldn't have done it without her. And here she is at the bottom of the property where the stables were. You can see the mid-level property there up above her. And just thanks a lot, King. So, excuse me for cutting you off.
no, thank you. Families are it.
They are.
Everything goes back to our families.
Indeed.
I just wanted to let everyone know that Brier's book can be purchased on Amazon. In approximately 2 weeks, it can be purchased through the independent bookstores like Diesel and Del Mar Heights Shopping Center. And thank you very much, Brier. And let's see if we have questions.
Sounds good.
Brier, Phil says, or has asked, I have heard that it was called the snake wall because it snaked back and forth up the hillside versus being a straight rectangle. Is that not the case?
I don't know, but that's always been my guess, is that, you know, standing out in the valley, looking up at the hill, you see that it does sort of roll up and down, and probably much in the same way that Serpentine Drive is named that, because it's snake-like. So I assume that's somebody came up with that because that's what it reminded them of.
Okay, and Betsy Nelson says, thank you for a wonderful story.
Oh, thank you.
Lorraine Dyson says, how special that talk was. I do have to ask, I had heard that the house on top of the hill had burned down. When was that?
Thanks so much for asking. Yes, the house that my mother grew up in and that original arts and crafts house burned in the early 40s. I do not know the exact date. We cannot find any records of the exact date. But I did learn from an old timer in Del Mar, a man named Don Terwilliger, that he was walking home from school when they saw the smoke. So that kind of helped place it in terms of at least the time of day, and obviously when school was in session, so not a holiday. According to the fire marshal telling my grandparents, it was an electrical fire. No one was in the home. My family had moved up into LA with the war threatening, and left all of their stuff, which, by the way, all burned, of course, in the fire, including most of our family photos. The photos that I was able to show you here were actually saved by Desi. And thanks to her and saving her photo album that I have any of these. But yeah, so it burned the place. It was so hot, it melted metal. It was a very hot fire. And the fire department got there in time, but they couldn't get water pressure up at the top of the hill to be able to put the fire out. So they were forced to just stand there and watch it burn.
Great answer there. Paul Hankart asks, did you ever raft or play in the lagoon?
No. It seemed pretty mucky. We called it the slough. And I never thought of that. That sounds like fun now.
Jeff Barnow asks, were the Torrey pines planted before Coy's acquisition, or were they added later?
To the best of my knowledge, they were there when he purchased the property.
All right. And then Paul Hankart also asks, was the airfield there when you were there?
Yes. And I know that airfield, because it was so short, my father flew a small private plane for his work. And often when he would come to visit us, he would fly down. And I don't think he ever landed on that airstrip. It was very short, the airstrip. That's one of the reasons it was used, the runway, that it was used for blimps during World War II, because of course they didn't need a runway. Yeah, it was there, but not very long. I remember when it was taken out and when the freeway was started to be put through.
And Phil also asks, thank you, Brier. This was a great learning episode. I ride my bike past the property every week and have always wondered about many of these things. So good answers, Brier. This is a great talk.
Thank you. That's awesome. You know, down at the bottom of the property, there's a educational, there's like a sort of a pier that goes out into the lagoon, and there's information and old photographs and so forth, and that's a lot of fun.
And Judith Tilliard asks, how long did Jessie live?
Jessie lived into her early 70s. She died in 73. A very sad loss.
Okay. And then Elaine Dodge said, who was your father, Brier?
My father was named Lloyd Wrench, and he actually ended up working for Monolith, and Monolith acquired a couple of cement plants, one in Fresno and one in Laramie, Wyoming. And my father ran those cement plants. And unfortunately, my father died when I was 20. So I never got to know him as an adult, but he was a lot of fun.
And Paul Hankart says, I used to live on Arabia Road. So is that near your, is that near that?
I don't know.
Okay, another question coming from the chat. First, Laura DeMarco asked, when was the fire that burned down the main house? And you had answered that already. And then
Right.
she says, I heard that the Burnetts sold part of their property to the Hardings, who built the nearby Delmar Castle with Richard Requa in 1925. Do you have any stories about the Hardings or other Delmar residents back then?
I know that the Hardings, you know, the articles in the newspaper in the 20s talked about the Burnett property, but also talked about the Harding property. It was my impression that Harding was already working with Richard Requa when my grandparents bought their property in 1924. So I think his relationship with Requa predated my grandfather's relationship, but I don't have evidence of that. The funny thing is, in asking about that, because you can see, you know, what was called the castle, I think it's still called the castle, the amazing Harding residence. People got it confounded with the wall. So they always thought, because we lived inside that wall, that we lived at the castle, which we thought was a real laugh, because believe me, after the house on the top of the hill burned down, the property on the mid-level of the property was then developed in, you know, retrofitted into a vacation home, what had been the old garages and so forth. That's where we spent our summers, and it was wonderful, but it was not glamorous at all. As I say in the book, it looked more like a motel on Route 66 with this giant expanse of concrete in front of it. We didn't mind as kids, but it was not glamorous at all. So we always had a laugh about it, thinking that it might be the castle.
And Stephanie Wild says, thank you for this fascinating presentation. We have already ordered the book.
Oh, thank you.
And I think that is it for the questions. Unless anybody else has something.
Okay.
This pretty view. It's actually, and I would just make a comment, this is a current picture. I think I took it in 2016. But one thing I love about it is I think that it really gives us a flavor of what it would have looked like almost 100 years ago, with the gardening and, you know, having been restored as the current owners have done so thoughtfully. So it's really a pleasure.
Thank you so much for an absolutely fascinating talk. If there are no more questions, then everyone stay healthy and good night.
Good night.